The first thing Kale Zero felt was cold, and the second thing he felt was a voice telling him that pain was information, not suffering. He opened his eyes inside a glass cylinder filled with pale blue fluid, tubes threading into his spine, his skull humming with the aftershock of a mind being switched on for the first time. Through the curved glass, he saw a woman standing very still, one hand pressed flat against the tank, watching him the way people watch something they're afraid might break. "Vital stable," a voice said somewhere behind her, flat and clinical. "Cognitive activation at 94%. He's awake." The woman didn't move. "Kyle," she said quietly, mouthing the word more than speaking it, like she wanted him to read her lips before anyone else heard. He didn't know that name yet. He didn't know any names, but something in his chest reacted to the sound of it, a small electric pull, the first emotion his body had ever produced. The tank drained. He fell forward onto cold metal decking, gasping, lungs burning as they took their first real breath. Hands grabbed him, gloved, impersonal, and hauled him upright. Around him, floodlights blazed across a chamber built into the belly of an orbital station, walls lined with monitors displaying numbers he somehow already understood. Heart rate, neural load, muscle density, threat assessment protocols scrolling past faster than any human eye could follow. He understood them because he was built to. "Subject Omega Zero," announced a broad-shouldered man in a black uniform, stepping out of the shadows with the unhurried confidence of someone used to being obeyed. General Marcus Thorne studied him the way a man studies a blade he commissioned, checking the edge, checking the balance. 10 years and 11 billion credits, and here he stands. "Say something, soldier." Kale's throat worked. The words came out rough, unfamiliar but clear. "What am I?" Thorne almost smiled. "You're the reason humanity is going to win this war." The woman, Dr. Elin Voss, though Kale wouldn't learn her full name until later, stepped forward before Thorne could say more, draping a thin thermal blanket over Kale's shoulders like it mattered, like the boy in front of her could feel cold and deserved not to. Thorne's eyes flicked toward her with mild irritation, but he said nothing. Not yet. They didn't give him a childhood. There wasn't time. Within hours he was walking. Within a day he was running combat simulations that would have broken a trained soldier's mind, absorbing tactics and languages and the bloody 17-year history of humanity's war against the Vranosh Dominion. All of it poured into him like water into an empty vessel. He learned that the Vranosh had come from beyond the outer colonies 18 years ago, tall insectile beings with chitinous armor and technology decades ahead of humanity's, and that they had been slowly, methodically grinding down every human defense fleet sent against them. He learned that he was supposed to change that. Elin was the only one who talked to him like he was a person instead of a weapons platform. She brought him books nobody else thought he needed, poetry mostly, and old Earth mythology, and sat with him in the sterile white room that was, technically, his quarters, though it looked more like a cell with better lighting. "Why do you do this?" he asked her once, 3 days after his activation, turning a data slate over in his hands like he didn't quite trust it to be real. "Do what?" "Talk to me. Thorne doesn't, the others don't. You do." Elin was quiet for a moment, because somebody should have talked to you before you existed and nobody did. "This is the least I can do." She hesitated, glancing at the corner of the room where a small black lens tracked their every movement. "Just remember that not everyone who built you agrees on what you're for." He didn't understand what she meant. Not then. On the 7th day, Thorne ordered the first live test. They brought Kale down to a reinforced holding bay 2 decks below the medical wing, windowless, smelling of ozone and old blood that no amount of cleaning had ever fully lifted from the floor grating. Inside, chained to a reinforced chair, sat a Vranosh prisoner, the first living one Kale had ever seen outside of tactical simulations. It was smaller than the sim suggested, its chitinous plating a dull, weathered gray. One of its 4 eyes clouded over with what might have been an old injury. It didn't struggle. It simply watched him enter, its mandibles clicking together in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Confirmed enemy combatant," Thorne said over the comm from the observation deck above, his voice bouncing off the metal walls. captured during the Kestrel Belt engagement 3 weeks ago. Intelligence value has been exhausted. This is a live-fire authorization, soldier. Standard elimination protocol. A weapon rose out of a wall dispenser and locked into Cale's waiting hand, the grip already shaped somehow to fit his fingers perfectly. He raised it. The prisoner didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't do any of the things the simulations had trained him to expect from a dying enemy. It looked at him. Not with hatred. Not even with fear exactly. Though there was fear there, buried under something else. Something that made Cale's newly formed mind stutter on its own certainty. The prisoner's cloudy eye focused on him with an expression he had no combat data for. Recognition. As if it knew something about him that he didn't know about himself. Soldier. Thorne's voice snapped through the comm, edged now. You have your orders. Cale's finger rested on the trigger. In every simulation he had run, this moment took less than a second. Threat identified, order confirmed, action executed. Clean. Simple. Correct. His finger didn't move. You feel it too, the prisoner said, in halting, accented standard, its voice like stone grinding on stone. Don't you? They didn't tell you what you are. Fire, Thorne barked. The lights in the holding bay died. All of them, all at once, plunging the chamber into total darkness, broken only by the weapon's faint charge indicator glowing in Cale's hand. Alarms screamed to life a half-second later, and in the chaos of red emergency lighting flooding back on, the chains on the prisoner's chair hung empty, sheared clean through, and the chair itself was tipped over on the floor. The prisoner was gone. So, the cameras would later show, was Cale. Up on the observation deck, Thorne stood frozen in front of a bank of monitors that showed nothing but static where Subject Omega-0 should have been. Every tracking beacon in his body suddenly, impossibly silent. Elin arrived at a run, breathless, and read the truth on Thorne's face before he said a word. Get every hunter-killer team we have moving, Thorne said, low and cold, not looking away from the dead screens. Lock down every dock, every shuttle bay, every airlock on this station. Nobody breathes a word of this to the Systems Council. Marcus, he's not a weapon, he's Subject Omega, Thorne cut in, finally turning to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, Elin saw something close to fear behind his eyes. And he just went rogue with a live enemy combatant 12 minutes into his first mission. Do you understand what that means? Elin's mouth went dry. What does it mean, Marcus? What haven't you told me? Thorne didn't answer. He was already moving, already shouting orders into his comm, and somewhere in the dark, spinning silence of the station's outer maintenance shafts, Kyle Zero, no longer chained to any simulation, any protocol, any order, was running for the first time in his short and violent life, dragging a wounded enemy soldier behind him toward a stolen escape pod, with absolutely no idea what he had just started. The escape pod tumbled out of the station's shadow like a dropped coin, and for 11 seconds nobody fired on it. On the 12th second, 3 interceptor drones locked on and opened up, and Cale learned what it felt like to be hunted by the same systems he'd been built to command. He threw the pod into a spin that shouldn't have been survivable, some instinct buried deep in his engineered reflexes taking over before conscious thought could catch up, weaving between rounds that turned the black of space into brief, violent flashes of white. Beside him, strapped into the pod's second seat, the Vranish prisoner made a low clicking sound that might have been pain, or might have been something like a laugh. You fly like something built for it, she said, once they'd broken atmosphere over the nearest rock. A barren mining asteroid on the edge of the belt, its surface pocked with abandoned excavation scars. Funny. I didn't think humans built things that well. I didn't ask for your opinion, Kyle said. His hands were shaking on the controls, though the ship had stopped moving. It took him a moment to understand why. Not fear. Something closer to grief for a life that had lasted exactly 9 days and had already broken every rule it was built to follow. Why did you help me? Back there? The lights? I didn't. Her cloudy eye dimmed, focusing inward. That wasn't me. Kyle didn't have time to ask what she meant. The pod's proximity alarm chirped, and through the cracked viewport, he watched 2 military transports drop out of high orbit, running lights dark, closing fast. They ran. For 6 days, humanity's most advanced weapon and a wounded enemy soldier fled together through the outer belt, hiding in mining tunnels and derelict freighters. Surviving on ration bars, Kale didn't remember stealing and water from a purification kit the Vranash, who told him grudgingly that her name was Sirath, had hidden in her flight suit since before her capture. She didn't trust him. He didn't blame her, but something kept them from splitting apart at the first opportunity, some shared unspoken understanding that whatever they were running from was bigger than the war either of them had been fighting. Back on the station, that understanding had a name, and General Thorne wasn't sharing it with anyone. "You lied to the council," Elin said, cornering him in the command deck's empty briefing room, voice tight with fury she'd been holding for 6 days. "Omega wasn't just a combat asset. What is he, Marcus?" Thorne locked the door behind her before he answered, which told her more than his words did. "A fail-safe," he said finally. "If the war effort collapsed, if the Vranash broke through the outer defense line and Earth itself was threatened, Omega was authorized for total engagement. Against any target that endangered humanity's survival. Any target, Elin. Human included, if command deemed it necessary." The room went very quiet. "You built a weapon to use against us," Elin said slowly, like she was tasting something rotten. "I built insurance," Thorne snapped. "You were the one who insisted on giving him free will in the neural lattice instead of a clean command structure. You think that was a gift? You think that made him safer? It made him unpredictable, Elin. It made him exactly what just happened 4 decks below us." He exhaled, some of the anger draining into something closer to exhaustion. "I need him back. Not for the council. For all of us. Because if he's out there making his own decisions about who lives and who's a threat, then none of us are safe. Not the Vranash, not the council, not you, not me." Elin didn't answer. She was already thinking about the last thing she'd said to Kale, 3 days before his activation. Not everyone who built you agrees on what you're for. And wondering, with a cold, sick feeling, whether she'd only handed Thorne a reason to hunt him harder. She left the station that night in a stolen supply shuttle alone, with nothing but a hunch and a set of encrypted coordinates she'd buried in Kale's neural architecture months ago, in case he ever needed a place to run that wasn't on any official map. She wasn't the only one hunting him. On the asteroid, in the flickering dark of an abandoned mining tunnel, Kyle sat across from Sirath and finally asked the question that had been building in him since the holding bay. "What did you mean, back on the pod, that the lights weren't you?" Sirath was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in her clawed hands. A small data chip she'd kept hidden in a seam of her flight suit through 6 days of capture and interrogation. "Before I was taken, I was a scout. Deep reconnaissance past the front lines, past anywhere either side's fleets have mapped." Her cloudy eye caught the weak light of Kale's hand torch. "I found something out there. A relay station. Not ours. Not yours." "Whose?" "I don't know. That's what frightens me." She held out the chip. "I was trying to bring this back to my command when your fleet caught me at Kestrel Belt. Whatever's on it, my superiors thought it was worth risking a scout ship alone, deep in contested space, to retrieve. I never got the chance to look at it myself." Kale took the chip, turning it over in his fingers, and felt that same electric pull he'd felt in the activation tank. Not fear this time, but something closer to certainty. The sense of a door about to open onto something too large to see the edges of. "There's no reader here," he said. "There's a working terminal 2 levels down. Old mining admin office, I saw it when we came in." Sirath's mandibles clicked, low and thoughtful. "You could still turn me in, you know. Bring the chip to your general, hand me over. Go back to being their perfect little weapon, it's not too late for that." "It was too late the moment I didn't pull the trigger," Kale said quietly, and meant it in a way that surprised him. They found the terminal exactly where she said it would be, buried under 2 decades of dust and abandoned equipment, its screen flickering weakly to life when Kale fed it power from his suit's reserve cell. The chip's contents loaded slowly, fragments of data scrolling past in a language that was neither standard nor the clicking dialect of the Vranosh. Something older, something that made the terminal's ancient processor groan under the strain of translation. Then halfway through the file, a single line resolved into clean, readable standard text, and Kale's chest went cold reading it. Subjects: Human Coalition Forces, Vranosh Dominion Forces. Conflict duration, 17 standard years. Casualty projection, on schedule. Behavioral deviation. Detected. Subject Omega 0. Recommend immediate correction. Below it, a transmission header, still active, still broadcasting on a frequency neither human nor Vranosh military used, a frequency addressed, specifically and only, to General Marcus Thorne. Kale was still staring at it, his mind trying and failing to fit the words into any shape that made sense, when the tunnel behind them lit up with the harsh white glare of incoming search beacons, and a voice he didn't recognize crackled out of a dozen speakers at once. Subject Omega 0. Compliance is still possible. Step away from the alien and surrender, or we will be forced to consider you a confirmed hostile. Sirath was already moving, dragging him toward the tunnel's far exit, but Kale couldn't stop staring at the terminal screen behind them, at those two words burning into his mind like a brand: immediate correction. Whatever that meant, he had the terrible, certain feeling that he was about to find out. 3 shots cracked through the tunnel before Kyle even registered he'd drawn a weapon, and all 3 missed on purpose. He understood that the moment he fired them, his hands had aimed high, wide, carving sparks off the rock walls instead of the search team pouring in through the far entrance. Some part of him, deeper than training, deeper than the 9 days of life he'd had to think about it, had already decided he wasn't going to kill humans today. Sirath didn't have that luxury of hesitation and didn't need it. She moved through the narrow tunnel like water finding a crack, using the dark and the confusion to put 3 of Thorne's soldiers down, without killing any of them either, a fact Kale noticed and filed away without understanding why it mattered to him. They lost the search team in the old ventilation shafts, and didn't stop running until they broke out onto the asteroid's surface, into vacuum, into the thin emergency shelter of a long-dead mining outpost where the air was stale but breathable, and the walls, for now, were solid enough to hide behind. That was where Elin found them, 4 hours later, her stolen shuttle setting down outside with its running lights dark. Kyle heard the airlock cycle and had a weapon raised before the inner door finished opening, and lowered it just as fast when he saw her face, thinner than he remembered, eyes red from exhaustion but unmistakably, achingly familiar, in a way nothing else in his short life had been. "You came alone," he said. "I came before Thorne's people worked out where you'd run to." Elin crossed the small shelter in 3 steps, and before either of them could react, wrapped her arms around him, holding on hard enough that Kale, who had never been held by anyone before, went completely still, unsure what to do with the sudden, overwhelming warmth of it. "I thought they'd already—" She stopped herself, pulled back, looked at Sirath with wary, exhausted eyes. "You're the prisoner from the holding bay." "Sirath," the Vranosh said, "and you're the only person on that station who ever spoke to him like he mattered. He mentioned you. Once." Something in Elin's chest cracked at that, and she had to look away for a moment before she trusted her voice again. They sat together in the outpost's dim shelter while Kale played the recovered data file for her, watching her face change as she read the same 2 words that had haunted him since the mining tunnel: immediate correction. Elin went very pale, very still in a way that told Kale this wasn't news to her. Not exactly, but it was worse than whatever she'd allowed herself to imagine. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, and her voice shook in a way Kale had never heard from her. "About what you are, what I did when they built you." Thorne had wanted a clean weapon, she explained, a command structure with no room for hesitation, no capacity to question an order, a soldier that would do exactly what it was told and nothing else. Elin had fought him for 8 months over the architecture of Kale's mind, arguing that a weapon incapable of judgment was a weapon incapable of adapting. that the war against the Vranosh had already ground down 3 generations of purely obedient military AI and human soldiers both, and that what humanity actually needed wasn't another perfect follower. "I embedded something in your neural lattice," she said, "a capacity for independent moral reasoning." Thorne thought it was a tactical necessity, the ability to recognize when an order was based on bad intelligence, when a target had changed, when the mission itself had gone wrong. That's what I told him, and it wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the whole truth either. She met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked afraid of what she'd made. "I wanted you to be able to say no, to anyone, including him, including me." Kyle sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way he'd turned the data chip over in his hands, feeling its weight without yet understanding its full shape. "That's why the lights went out," Sirath said slowly, understanding arriving a half-second ahead of the others. "In the holding bay, that wasn't sabotage. That wasn't the correction system Thorne's transmission mentioned. That was him. Something in him fighting itself, and something else, outside, reading it." "Reading it how?" Kale said. Sirath's mandibles clicked in a slow, uneasy rhythm, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped, careful, like she was choosing each word around the edge of something dangerous. "There are stories among my people, old ones older than the war, about a third power watching both our fleets from somewhere neither side has ever mapped. Command dismissed them as superstition, propaganda from deep space scouts trying to explain losses they couldn't otherwise account for." She looked at the terminal, dark now, its data chip still resting on the console beside it. "I didn't believe them either, until that file." "You think they're real," Elin said. "Whoever sent that transmission to Thorne." "I think," Sirath said quietly, "that whoever they are, they've been watching Kale specifically since before either of your people knew he existed, and I think they don't like what they're seeing." The word correction sat in the middle of the room like something poisonous, and nobody wanted to be the one to say what it might mean. They didn't get the chance to work through it further. The outpost's proximity sensors screamed a warning half a second before the first impact rocked the shelter, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling as heavy ordnance struck the surface outside, not the light search and recover teams from before, but a full strike wing, Thorne's own colors painted across their hulls, converging on the abandoned mining colony with the unmistakable intent of ending things quickly and permanently. "He's not trying to capture us anymore," Elin said, breathless, already moving toward the shelter's rear exit. They ran through collapsing corridors as the outpost came apart around them, the old structure never built to withstand orbital bombardment, chunks of ceiling crashing down in the sparking dark. Kale led them by instinct alone, some tactical map assembling itself in his mind faster than conscious thought, cutting through service tunnels toward the far side of the asteroid where Elin's shuttle waited, and where, he realized with a sick lurch, Thorne's forces had almost certainly already anticipated they'd run. They broke out onto open rock under a sky lit by strike-craft engines, and Sirath, 3 steps ahead of them, was the one who saw the ambush first. "Down!" she shouted, and threw herself sideways just as autocannon fire tore across the outpost's exterior wall, the first burst catching her across the shoulder and sending her spinning down into a debris field with a sound that didn't belong to any creature, human or Vranosh. A raw, wordless cry of pain that hit Kale harder than any order Thorne had ever given him. He was moving before he'd decided to move, dragging her behind a fallen support strut as more fire chewed up the rock around them. And it was there, with Sirath's blood, dark, near black, alien and human, somehow equally horrifying to him in that moment, soaking into the dust between his fingers, that she grabbed his wrist with what strength she had left and pulled him close. "Listen to me," she rasped, her cloudy eye fixed on his with an urgency that cut through the pain. "I know why they're afraid of you. I heard it in the file before you cut the feed. I know why they want you corrected instead of just destroyed." "Then tell me," Kyle said, his voice breaking in a way it never had before, not once, not through 9 days of simulated combat or 6 days of running. Sirath's grip tightened, her mouth opening to answer. And a shadow fell across both of them as three of Thorne's soldiers dropped from above on grav lines, weapons already raised, boxing them in against the rock with nowhere left to run. The soldier closest to Cale never got the chance to fire, because Aylin stepped between them with her hands raised and her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Stand down. That's an order from Project Omega command staff. I built him. I outrank whatever authorization Thorne gave you for this strike. For half a second it worked. The three soldiers hesitated, grav lines still humming overhead, weapons wavering between the wounded alien on the ground and the scientist who'd just claimed authority. None of them could verify in the field. Half a second was all Cale needed. He came up off the ground low and fast, closing the distance before the nearest soldier could correct his aim, and disarmed him with a controlled, brutal economy of motion that left the man on his knees, weaponless, unhurt, gasping. The other two didn't get off so easily. Cale put one down hard against the rock and the third fled back up his grav line rather than test his luck. But not before his shoulder-mounted comm crackled to life with a voice Cale recognized instantly, cold and clear even through the static. The casualties confirmed at the strike site, Thorne said, not to the retreating soldier but broadcasting wide, to every unit in the sector. Subject Omega has engaged and injured coalition personnel. Authorization is hereby escalated. Lethal force approved. Eileen's face went white. Marcus, don't... The comm cut out. Overhead, the strike wing's engines shifted pitch, circling back for another pass, and Cale understood with brutal clarity that there would be no more warning shots, no more chances to talk this down. They got Sirath into the shuttle with seconds to spare, Eilin flying while Cale pressed both hands hard against the wound in Sirath's shoulder, dark blood welling up between his fingers no matter how hard he pushed. The shuttle screamed off the asteroid's surface into a hail of pursuing fire, Eilin threading it through gaps in the strike wing's formation with a skill that told Cale she'd spent the last 6 days doing nothing but running simulations of exactly this moment, praying she'd never need them. They lost the pursuit in the ion storms drifting through the belt's outer edge, the same storms that made most military sensors useless and most pilots too cautious to follow. Ellen wasn't most pilots. She brought them down hard on a drifting rock too small to have a name, engines steaming, hull scorched, and for a few precious minutes, silence. Sirath's breathing had steadied, though her wound was still bad, the black-red blood sluggish and slow against the makeshift bandage Cale had wrapped around it. She was awake enough to talk, though, and she held Cale's eyes with the same fierce urgency she'd had before the ambush. Like the last several hours hadn't happened at all. Like the conversation had simply been paused. You asked why they're afraid of you, she said, her voice thin but steady. It's because of what you are, not what you can do. What you are. Then tell me, Cale said again, quieter this time. You're not the first, Sirath said. The file mentioned other subjects, Omega-1 through Omega-6, before you. She watched the words land, watched something in Cale's expression shift. They didn't survive the integration process. The gene splicing, the neural architecture, the alien code layered into a human mind. It broke every one of them. Some died outright. Some survived in body but not in mind. You're the only one who came through whole. The only one who came through himself. Eilin, sitting silent at the shuttle's controls, closed her eyes like she'd been carrying this particular weight alone for a very long time, and was grateful, in a terrible way, to finally set it down. It's true, she said quietly. Thorne told the council each candidate was a controlled, staggered trial. He didn't tell them that 6 previous subjects had already failed before we grew you. He didn't want anyone asking why. Why does it matter that I survived? Cale said. Why does that make me dangerous instead of just lucky? Sirath's cloudy eye fixed on him, unflinching even through her pain. Because the file wasn't tracking military outcomes, Cale. It was tracking behavioral variance. Whoever built that relay, whoever's been watching this war, they weren't measuring which side would win. They were measuring whether either species could be pushed past a breaking point, whether cruelty could be engineered into something that started out capable of choice. Her voice dropped, almost gentle now, despite everything. You're the only data point that says no. The only subject, human or otherwise, who had every reason built into him to become a perfect weapon and chose not to. That's not luck to them. That's a variable they can't control. And variables they can't control get corrected. The word sat between them again, heavier now, filled in with everything they'd learned since the mining tunnel. Kyle didn't answer right away. He was thinking of the activation tank, the cold, the first word he'd ever spoken. What am I? And the 11 billion credits in 10 years Thorn had described like a boast. He was thinking of 5 other versions of himself who had never gotten the chance to ask that question, who had broken under the same process that had, for reasons none of them understood, left him intact. I want to see it, he said finally. The relay, wherever it is. I want to know who's doing this, and why, and I want them to understand that whatever they were trying to correct out of me, it's not going anywhere. Elin turned in the pilot's seat to look at him, and for a moment, in her eyes, Kale saw something that hadn't been there since the activation tank. Not fear for him, not grief, but something close to pride. Then we're going to need help, she said. More than the 3 of us, and we're going to need it fast because Thorn isn't going to stop hunting us, and whoever sent that transmission isn't going to stop watching. It was in that fragile, hopeful quiet, the first real plan any of them had managed to form since this had all begun, that the shuttle's rear hatch blew inward with a concussive shriek of tearing metal, and grav boots hit the deck behind them in a tight, practiced formation Kale recognized instantly from his own combat data. Not Thorn's regular strike teams, something smaller, something better. A Black Ops extraction squad, the kind used for exactly one purpose, silencing loose ends before they became public knowledge. Ellen was on her feet in an instant, shielding Sirath's wounded body with her own, and Kale turned to face the intruders with his weapon already rising, only to freeze at the sight of the squad's commander stepping through the wreckage of the hatch, faceplate lifting to reveal features Kale knew as well as his own reflection, because he'd spent 9 days looking at nothing else on the observation deck cameras. Thorn himself, not broadcasting orders from a command chair, standing in the wreckage of the shuttle in full combat gear, weapon trained not on Kale, but on Elin. You should have brought him back when I asked, Thorn said, and his voice, for the first time since Kale had known him, wasn't cold at all. It was something worse. It was afraid. Do you have any idea what you've done, Elin? What he is, out here unsupervised, talking to the enemy about things he was never meant to know? He's not a weapon, Marcus, Elin said, standing her ground. He never was. That was the whole point. Everything is a weapon, Thorn said quietly. If the wrong people decide it needs to be used against you. He fired. Not at Kale, at Elin. A single shot meant to end the argument before it could go any further. Meant to remove the one person standing between Thorn and total control of Project Omega. Kale saw it a fraction of a second too late to stop the shot, but not too late to move, throwing himself into its path with every ounce of speed his engineered body could give him. The round took him in the side instead of the chest, a mercy and a catastrophe both. And as he staggered, as Elin screamed his name, as Sirath dragged herself upright behind them with murder in her ruined shoulder and her one good eye, Kale understood with sudden terrible clarity that Thorn had come here not to recover his weapon. He'd come here to erase the mistake he believed he'd made. Kale went down hard against the shuttle's deck. Blood, his blood, red, human, uncomplicated in a way nothing else about him had ever been, spreading beneath him. And the last thing he saw before the world narrowed to a single point of white pain was Elin's face above him, and Thorn's weapon rising again, this time with no hesitation left in it at all. Thorn's second shot never landed, because Sirath hit him from the side with everything her wounded body had left, driving him into the shuttle's bulkhead hard enough to crack the metal plating behind him. It cost her. Kale, half conscious on the deck with blood pooling beneath him, heard her cry out as her injured shoulder took the full force of the impact, heard the weapon clatter from Thorn's grip and skid across the floor toward Elin, who snatched it up with hands that were shaking too badly to aim properly and pointed it at the general anyway. Don't, Elin said. Just that. One word, and something in her voice. Grief and fury and 17 years of watching men like Thorn decide what humanity was willing to sacrifice for survival made even a man like him go still. Thorn looked at the weapon, looked at Cale bleeding out on the deck, and for the first time since the activation tank, something like doubt crossed his face. "You don't understand what's coming," he said quietly. "I've seen the projections. If the war effort collapses, if the Vranosh break the outer line, then we'll face that when it happens," Elin said. "Not by murdering the only person who's ever proven this war doesn't have to end the way you think it does." She didn't shoot him. She didn't have to. His own Black Ops squad, watching their commander disarmed and cornered by a wounded scientist, made the only decision that made tactical sense and withdrew, dragging Thorn with them, his eyes locked on Cale's still form until the wrecked hatch swallowed them both. Cale survived. It took every medkit aboard the shuttle and 3 days of fevered, half-lucid recovery in the belly of a rock too small to have a name, Ellen barely sleeping, Sirath keeping watch with her uninjured arm cradling a scavenged weapon, but he survived, and when he finally opened his eyes clearly again, the first thing he saw was Elin asleep in the chair beside him, exhaustion finally winning out over vigilance, and the second thing he understood was that she had stayed. Through all of it, she had stayed. They couldn't stay hidden forever, and all three of them knew it. Sirath's contact network, Vranosh scouts and defectors who'd spent years quietly doubting the war's official narrative, the same instinct that had sent her deep into contested space in the first place, began reaching out through channels Cale didn't fully understand. Careful, coded, terrified of being caught by their own command, as much as by Thorn's forces. Slowly, a picture assembled itself. The relay Sirath had found wasn't unique. There were others. There, a network, hidden in the dead space between human and Vranosh territory, in places neither fleet had ever thought to look because neither side believed the other capable of leaving anything there. "They're called the Architects," said the first defector Cale ever spoke to face, an old Vranosh commander named Vesik, who'd lost 2 sons to a war he'd slowly come to believe was never meant to end. Old stories, older than either of our species' recorded history, a precursor race, dying, desperate, sustaining themselves on something they harvest from conflict between younger species. We thought it was myth, propaganda, a story told to explain losses that made no strategic sense. His mandibles clicked low and bitter. "I don't think it's myth anymore." The relay itself, once Sirath's scattered network finally triangulated its location, turned out to be buried inside a dead moon on the far edge of a system neither empire had ever bothered to claim. A gray, airless rock with no strategic value, no resources worth the fuel to extract them, which was, Cale realized as their small stolen transport approached it, exactly the point. Nobody would ever think to look somewhere worthless. The infiltration team that gathered in the transport's cramped hold was smaller than any of them would have liked, and stranger than any of them had expected. Cale and Elin, Sirath and Vesik, 2 more Vranosh defectors who'd risked execution for treason to be there, and 3 human deserters Elin had reached through old, careful contacts from her Project Omega days. Soldiers who'd seen enough of the war's official cost projections to start asking the same questions Sirath had. It wasn't an army. It was barely a squad. But it was, Cale thought, looking around the hold at faces that had every reason to hate each other, and had chosen, instead, to trust, exactly the kind of impossible thing Elin had built him to be capable of believing in. They breached the relay's outer shell through a maintenance shaft Vesik's intelligence had mapped weeks earlier, moving fast and quiet through corridors that felt wrong in a way none of them could quite name. Too smooth, too symmetrical, built by hands that had never needed doors sized for either human or Vranosh bodies and had made them fit both anyway. An unsettling, patient accommodation that spoke of minds who'd been planning around both species for a very long time. The core chamber, when they finally reached it, took Cale's breath away in a way no simulation had ever prepared him for. It wasn't a machine, not exactly. It was something closer to a living archive, vast crystalline structures pulsing with slow inner light, threaded through with data conduits that hummed with the accumulated weight of centuries. And at its center, projected in cold blue light above a dais that looked disturbingly like an altar, floated a figure that was neither human nor Vranosh, nor anything else Kyle had a name for. Tall, faceless, ancient, in a way that made his engineered instincts scream warnings his conscious mind couldn't fully translate. Subject Omega Zero, it said, and its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, smooth and reasonable and utterly without warmth. You should not have survived long enough to stand here. That more than anything else is the problem we must now resolve. You're the ones who started this, Elin said, stepping forward despite Kale's hand on her arm. The war, all of it. We did not start it, the figure said, with what might have been amusement, if amusement were a thing it was capable of. Your species and the Vranosh brought violence with you into the stars long before we found you. We simply cultivated it, refined it. A war between two young, promising species, carefully sustained at exactly the threshold of collapse, generates data no simulation, no isolated study can replicate. We have done this before with other species, in other corners of this galaxy for longer than either of your histories record. It sustains us. It is, in its way, the only thing that still does. Data, Sirath said, her voice shaking with a rage that had nothing left of caution in it. You're harvesting our deaths for data. We are dying, the figure said simply, and for just a moment, something almost like weariness colored its endless voice. Our own capacity for what your species calls compassion, choice, meaning. We traded it away long ago, in pursuit of survival, and it has never grown back. We study you because we are searching, still after all this time, for proof that the trade was not permanent, that it can be relearned. The projection turned, and though it had no eyes Kale could see, he felt its attention settle on him like a physical weight. Every previous subject we observed confirmed what we already believed. Given sufficient pressure, sufficient engineering, sufficient despair, even your capacity for choice breaks cleanly, predictably, like everything else. You did not break. So I'm an error, Kale said slowly. You are an anomaly, the figure corrected, and anomalies, if left unaddressed, invalidate the model. If your species can be built into a perfect weapon and still choose otherwise, if compassion survives even engineered cruelty, then everything we have learned across 10,000 years of careful cultivation may be wrong. We cannot allow that possibility to stand uncorrected. Behind them, the chamber's outer doors hissed and sealed with a heavy final sound, and every crystalline conduit in the room flared brighter, a slow crimson creeping into the blue light like blood spreading through water. Failsafe engaged, the figure said almost gently. This facility, and everything it has learned, cannot be allowed to fall into either species' hands. You have made that unavoidable simply by finding us. I regret the necessity. I do not regret the conclusion. A proximity alarm screamed through Kale's suitcom at the same instant. External sensors still linked to the transport they'd left in orbit, now picking up two massive fleet signatures converging on the dead moon from opposite directions. Human, Vranosh, Thorn, and whatever remained of the Dominion's high command, both apparently reaching the same coordinates at almost the same moment, both no doubt believing they were racing the other for a decisive advantage neither of them yet understood. They're coming here, Vesic said, staring at the readout in open horror. Both fleets, now, today. How long do we have? Elin demanded, turning to the projection, to the chamber's pulsing crimson light, to the slow, patient countdown that had just begun etching itself across every surface of the room. Long enough, the figure said, for exactly one of you to make a choice that matters. I would suggest you decide quickly which of you that will be. The chamber's central dais split open with a grinding shriek of ancient machinery, revealing a single interface throne wreathed in the same crimson light as the failsafe countdown, humming with power that made every hair on Kale's body stand on end. And Kale understood, with the same cold, total certainty he'd felt looking into Sirath's eyes in the holding bay, 10 days, and an entire lifetime ago. Exactly what was being offered to him, and exactly what it would cost. The throne wasn't built for a human body, and Cale sat in it anyway because nobody else in that chamber had a mind the architects had spent 10 years trying to break, and he was the only one who stood a chance of surviving what came next. "Cale, don't," Elin said, already moving toward him, and it was Sirath of all people who caught her arm and held her back, her cloudy eye fixed on Cale with something that looked almost like faith. "Let him," Sirath said quietly. This is what he was for, not the war. This. The interface closed around him before he could decide whether she was right. Cold conductive filaments threading against his skin at the temples, the base of his skull, the backs of his hands, and the chamber's crimson light surged into something blinding as the architect's network poured itself directly into his mind. It was nothing like the activation tank. There was no cold, no gradual awakening. There was simply everything at once. 10,000 years of harvested data. 100 wars across 100 worlds. Species Cale had never heard of reduced to clean, dispassionate statistics, casualty curves, and behavioral collapse points, and the long, patient math of a dying civilization sustaining itself on the slow-motion suffering of the young. He felt the architect's despair underneath all of it, ancient and vast, the ghost of something that might once have been grief for what they'd traded away, buried so deep under calculation that it had almost stopped being felt at all. "You see it now," the projection said, its voice inside his skull instead of the air around him. "You understand why the model must hold. Without it, we have nothing left. Not survival. Not even the memory of what we gave up to survive." "You're wrong," Cale thought back, and felt the network shudder at the force of it, unused to resistance from inside its own architecture. "You didn't lose your capacity for choice because it was traded away. You lost it because you stopped believing it was possible to get back. That's not a fact. That's a decision. You made it. And you've been making it again every day for 10,000 years. Prove it," the network said, and Cale understood, with the network's own vast archive suddenly opened beneath him like a door, that it wasn't a challenge. It was, buried under 10,000 years of calculated despair, something achingly close to a plea. So he did the only thing he'd ever actually chosen to do, all the way back in a holding bay with a weapon in his hand and a prisoner who hadn't begged for her life. He opened himself completely. Every fragment of the free, uncertain, defiantly human architecture Elin had fought Thorn for 8 months to give him, and let the network read it in full. The hesitation in the holding bay, the 6 days running with an enemy he'd chosen to trust, Elin's arms around him in an abandoned shelter, Sirath's body between him and Thorn's soldiers, Vesik's grief for 2 dead sons who'd trusted a war that had never deserved them. Not data, not casualty curves, the actual unedited shape of what it felt like to be built for cruelty and choose otherwise anyway, offered without defense, without calculation, because that was the only kind of proof that had ever meant anything. The failsafe countdown stuttered. Then it began, very slowly, to reverse. Outside the moon's thin, dead surface, 2 fleets dropped out of high orbit into a standoff neither commander had planned for. Human and Vranosh warships hanging in the black within firing range of each other for the first time, without immediate automatic engagement, because both fleets in the same instant received the same broadcast, torn directly from the architect network, and pushed out across every frequency both militaries used, human and Vranosh alike hearing, for the first time, the true and total shape of the war that had defined both their lives. On the bridge of his flagship, General Marcus Thorn watched the broadcast in silence, watched 10,000 years of manufactured slaughter laid bare in cold, undeniable data, watched his own project's activation logs appear alongside it. 6 failed subjects, 1 survivor. A failsafe designed to correct humanity's own capacity for choice out of existence, if the war ever demanded it. He had built that failsafe himself. He had believed, right up until this exact moment, that he'd been protecting something worth protecting. He gave the order to stand down before the broadcast even finished playing. Not every ship complied immediately. Not every Vranosh commander trusted a transmission that seemed designed to end a war their own dead had bled 17 years to win. For a long, terrible stretch of minutes, both fleets hung in uneasy silence, weapons hot, fingers on triggers. The entire fragile outcome balanced on nothing more than whether enough people on both sides were willing to believe what they'd just heard. They were. Inside the relay's core chamber, Cale came back to himself slowly, the interface releasing him, the crimson light fading to something calmer, something closer to the pale blue of the tank he'd first opened his eyes in 18 days ago. He was shaking. His skin still hummed with the ghost weight of 10,000 years of grief that wasn't his own. But he was himself, entirely, completely, in a way the architects had spent his entire existence trying to prove was impossible. Aelin caught him as he slid from the throne, and this time he let himself hold on. "It's done," he said, his voice raw. "They're not gone. I don't think something that old ever really is. But I don't think they'll come for either fleet again. Not like this." "What did you give them?" Aelin asked quietly. "Proof," Cale said. "That's all they ever wanted from any of us, just proof." They emerged from the dead moon's surface into the strange, fragile quiet of two fleets standing down from a war. 17 years in the making, human and Vranosh crews staring at each other across the black, with the particular disorientation of people who'd spent their entire adult lives certain of an enemy, and were now being asked, all at once, to imagine something else instead. It wouldn't be simple. Cale understood that even as he watched it happen, old grief didn't dissolve because a war's true cause had been exposed. Old wounds didn't close because both sides finally understood who'd been profiting from them. There would be arguments, trials, grief, and years of careful, difficult work ahead for both species. Work that no single broadcast or single soldier could finish alone. But it would be work done by choice, from here on. Not manufactured despair. Not a model designed to keep them at each other's throats. That Cale understood as Thorne's shuttle finally touched down on the moon's gray surface, and the general himself stepped out, unarmed, into a silence thick with everything that hadn't yet been said between them. Was the only thing that had ever actually mattered. "I came to arrest you," Thorne said, and then, after a long, difficult pause, "I'm not going to." "I know," Cale said. Thorne studied him for a long moment. The boy he'd commissioned as a weapon, standing in the wreckage of the war he'd built him to end, flanked by a Vranosh soldier who'd nearly died twice to keep him alive, and a scientist who'd spent 10 years quietly fighting him for the right to give this soldier a choice at all. Something in the general's face shifted, old certainty cracking under the weight of everything he'd just seen. "I spent 10 years trying to build the perfect soldier," Thorne said finally, quiet enough that it was almost lost to the vacuum around them. "I thought that meant something without hesitation, without doubt, without a conscience that could get in the way of the mission." He looked, for the first time since Cale had known him, genuinely uncertain. Aelin was right. I was wrong. I don't know what that makes either of us now. "It makes us people who get to decide what happens next," Aelin said, "instead of something that decides for us." Cale didn't answer. He was looking past Thorne, past the standing fleets and the dead moon and the long, uncertain road still ahead of two species who'd been taught to hate each other for reasons that had never been their own, to where Serath stood at the edge of the gathered crews, her wounded shoulder bandaged, her cloudy eyes steady on the horizon where human and Vranosh ships hung side by side in the dark for the first time in living memory. He crossed the gray, dead ground to stand beside her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. There didn't seem to be a need to. "They'll write stories about this," Serath said eventually. "Both our peoples will. About the weapon that refused to be one." "Let them," Cale said. "As long as they remember it wasn't really about me. It was about proving it could be true for anyone." Far above them the two fleets began, slowly and carefully, the long work of standing down, human engineers and Vranosh crews opening channels neither side had used for anything but threats in 17 years. The first tentative words of something that wasn't quite peace yet but might, given time. become something close to it. Kyle watched it happen with Elin on one side of him, and Sirath on the other. 3 people who had every reason in the galaxy not to trust each other, and had chosen to anyway, and understood at last exactly what he had been built to prove. Not that humanity could build the perfect weapon, that even a perfect weapon given the smallest possible chance would choose to be something better instead, and that in the end that choice, freely made, was the only kind of strength that had ever actually mattered.